I'm not sure why I do this to myself. So I've been down a rabbit hole lately, a deep one. I started looking into what happened to the Ark of the Covenant. You know, that gold box with the cherubim and Indiana Jones and all that. And I figured it would be a fun little side quest. You know, maybe a couple theories, maybe some treasure hunter stuff, whatever. And then I found this verse in Jeremiah that completely broke my brain. Because here's the thing. There are like a dozen theories about this thing, about where the ark ended up. Yeah, some think it was Ethiopia, Egypt, a cave under a mountain or the Temple Mount. And people have been arguing about this for literally thousands of years. Scholars, treasure hunters, whoever makes these weird History Channel documentaries that are on at 2 a.m., everyone's got their answer. But there's this one passage in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16. And when I heard it, I was like, wait, why doesn't anyone talk about this? Because if this verse means what I think it means, then maybe we've been asking the wrong questions the whole time. And we'll get there. But first, I need to take you through what the Ark of the Covenant actually was, why it mattered, and why its disappearance is such a big deal. Because the more I dug into this, the weirder it got. So first, we're going to talk about what the Ark actually was, and then we will work through the theories one by one. And if you like weird deep dives into the Bible and weird parts of history, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It helps out small channels like mine. And as always, thank you for watching. I can't believe I get to talk about weird things like this, and a few people find it halfway entertaining. But with that all being said, let's get into it. All right, so to understand why the Ark's disappearance is such a big deal, we need to understand what this thing actually was. And I don't just mean just physically, although we'll get there. I mean what it represented in Israelite theology. So the Ark of the Covenant was, at its most basic level, a gold-covered wooden chest. Exodus chapter 25 gives us the dimensions. It was about 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide and high. And in modern terms, that's roughly 4 feet long and then 2.5 feet wide and tall. Not huge, but it was portable, actually. And it also had rings on the sides and poles that the Levites would use to carry it. On top of the ark was something called the kaporet, usually translated mercy seat. And on either end of this lid were 2 golden cherubim facing each other with their wings stretched out over the center. And this is the kind of crucial part about this whole thing, is that the space between the cherubim, that was understood to be God's throne, his footstool, the place where Yahweh's presence or his glory actually dwelled on earth. And so this is why the ark was kept in the Holy of Holies, which was the innermost chamber of the first tabernacle, and later on in Solomon's temple. So this wasn't just a fancy box with, a couple of historical artifacts in it, although it did contain the tablets of the law, the 10 Commandments, Aaron's rod, and a pot of manna. This was actually the intersection point between heaven and earth, the physical location of God's presence among his people. And so the language that the Bible uses for this is consistent and important. And keep this in mind for later. The phrase enthroned above the cherubim or seated between the cherubim shows up multiple times. In Exodus 25, 1 Samuel 4 verse 4, 1 Chronicles chapter 13 verse 6, and 2 Kings. In the same phrase, it's the technical description where Yahweh actually dwells. Now, inside the ark were 2 stone tablets, the ones that Moses brought down from Sinai with the 10 Commandments. This is why it's called the Ark of the Covenant. It contained the terms of God's agreement with Israel. So when we talk about the ark disappearing, we're not just talking about this is just some random historical artifact that the Israelites lost. This was the throne of God gone missing. It was the physical location of God's presence on earth, and it was just gone. And the Bible, which lovingly describes the construction of this thing to the very last detail, has nothing explicit to say about its fate and where it went. And that's ultimately the mystery. Where did it go? Where is it hiding? And why do certain groups actually think that they have it? There are a handful of theories, so we're going to go through them one by one. Let's start with one that basically no scholar takes seriously. But it is worth mentioning because it exists and it tells us something about how these disputes kind of work. So the Samaritans, if you know your New Testament, there was this huge tension between the Jews and the Samaritans. The Samaritans believed that the ark never reached Jerusalem at all. And according to their tradition, the priest Eli created a fake ark, a fake tabernacle, fake vessels, the whole thing for a rival worship site. Meanwhile, the real ark was hidden by a high priest named Uzi in a cave called Mount Gerizim, which is the Samaritan holy mountain, where it will remain until true worship is restored. Now, there's no textual, archaeological, really any evidence of this. The Samaritan religious documents are, the ones that we have are like 11th, 12th, and 13th century. And the claim requires us to believe basically that everything in the 1st and 2nd Samuel about the ark being at Shiloh and the Jerusalem is either wrong or describing a counterfeit. The historian Josephus does mention a Samaritan in the time of Pontius Pilate who promised to show people where Moses had deposited the ark on Mount Gerizim, which is odd because according to the Torah, Moses never entered the promised land. So either Josephus got it wrong or this Samaritan was making stuff up for propaganda purposes. Either way, this theory doesn't really hold up. But this is why I mention it, because it shows us that people have been arguing about the ark's location for a very, very long time. This isn't, a modern obsession. The mystery of the ark has been a point of contention for thousands of years. Okay, so let's talk about the one that you probably do know. This is the Raiders of the Lost Ark theory, Indiana Jones. And it was actually proposed by serious scholars in the 19th century, guys like Sigmund Mowinckel, who did foundational work on Psalms, and this guy named Julian Morgenstern. And the theory goes like this. In 1 Kings chapter 14, we read that in the 5th year of King Rehoboam, that's Solomon's son, Pharaoh Shishak of Egypt came up against Jerusalem and took away the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the king's house. He took away everything. It says everything. So the argument is that, that would probably include the ark. Shishak takes it back to Egypt, specifically to Tanis, which is the capital city. In the movie, it gets buried in a sandstorm. God gets angry, and then it sits there until Indiana Jones shows up. But this is where it gets a little complicated with this one. Most scholars identified the biblical Shishak with an Egyptian pharaoh named Shashank the first. Same time period. The name sounds similar, and it seems like a match. And this identification is actually one of the major anchor points for correlating Egyptian and biblical chronology. But there are problems. The first problem is the First Kings passage doesn't specifically mention the ark. It says that he took treasures and everything, but does everything refer back to the temple or to the king's house, which is mentioned right after? The Hebrew language is actually ambiguous on that. And the second problem is that, and this is kind of like the big one, Shashank's own account of his campaign, which survives Egyptian records, doesn't mention the ark. And it also doesn't mention Jerusalem, the capital city of Judah. Supposedly, his biggest prize isn't even on the conquest list. Now, that being said, there are scholars who question whether Shishak and Shashank should be even identified with one another. There's this article by this guy named John Bimsum called Shashank and Shishak that lays out the entire problems. And the problems aren't minor. When you try to line up Shashank's account with the biblical account, they're not just a little different, they're actually pretty contradictory in multiple places. But let's just set that aside. Even if we accept the identification, we've got an Egyptian pharaoh who supposedly raids Jerusalem and takes the ark, the greatest religious treasure in the region, and he doesn't mention it. He doesn't mention the city, and, that's a pretty significant omission. And the other problem with this one is Isaiah chapter 37, verse 16. So this is during the reign of King Hezekiah, which is about 150 to 200 years after Shishak's original invasion. And listen to how Hezekiah prays. O Lord of hosts, God of Israel, enthroned above the cherubim, you are the God, you alone of all the kingdoms in the earth. Enthroned above the cherubim. Seems to be talking about the ark, and that's a very specific phrase used to describe Yahweh's presence on the ark. And so if the ark had been taken by Shishak like 150 years earlier, why is Hezekiah using that language? Why is he praying to the God who sits above the cherubim as if the cherubim and the ark attached to are still there? So some people argue that he's referring to the giant cherubim statues in Solomon's temple and not the ark. But the thing with that, though, is that same phrase, enthroned above cherubim, is used in Exodus 25 for the mercy seat. It's used in 1 Samuel 4 when the ark is captured by the Philistines. It's used in 1 Chronicles 13 when David brings the ark to Jerusalem. Every other time this phrase appears, it's clearly referring to the Ark of the Covenant. It seems like special pleading to say this one time and kind of have it mean something different. So the Shishak theory has real problems. The Ark isn't mentioned in the biblical account. It isn't mentioned in the Egyptian account. And we have later biblical texts that seem to assume that the ark is still there. The third theory is a little bit more obscure. Jehoash was the king of the northern kingdom of Israel. Remember, after Solomon dies, the monarchy splits into the north and south. Jehoash invaded Jerusalem around 802 BC during the reign of Amaziah, and he broke down part of the city wall, and 2 Kings says that he seized all the gold and the silver and all the vessels that were found in the house of the Lord. Again, here, there's really no mention of the ark, and we still have that Hezekiah passage in Isaiah 37 coming about 100 years later using that same ark language. So this theory doesn't really solve anything. The fourth and fifth theories are about the faithful priests and the Ethiopia connection. Now we are getting into the theories that people really latch onto. These two are related, so I'm just going to be taking them together. The idea here is that during the reign of Manasseh, one of the most wicked kings in Judah's history, faithful priests or Yahweh-worshiping kings removed the ark to protect it from desecration. Manasseh is accused of all sorts of abominations, including putting an image of Asherah in the temple. And the candidates for who might have removed the ark include Ahaz, Hezekiah, Josiah, or just unnamed faithful priests. The thinking is like this. These godly people saw the apostasy coming, they saw the pollution of the temple, and they took the most holy object and then hid it safe somewhere. Josiah is often a favorite for this, especially in popular speculation. So Randall Price, who is a legitimate archaeologist, I think, has argued for this view. But the problem is Josiah is portrayed in the Bible as basically being the best king that Judah has ever had after the split. So if he did something as monumentally pious as saving the ark from destruction, why wouldn't the text mention it? The biblical account glorifies Josiah. It would be incredible if this deed went completely unrecorded. And then there's 2 Kings chapter 21. This is the verse about Manasseh putting the Asherah in the temple. And listen carefully to what it actually says. The carved image of Asherah that he had made, he had set in the house of the Lord, said to David and to Solomon his son, "In this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever." It says in the house. It doesn't specifically say in the Holy of Holies. And that matters because the argument is that Manasseh polluted the Holy of Holies, which would have motivated the priest to remove the ark. But the text doesn't actually say that he did that. And there's even a command in Deuteronomy chapter 16, verse 21, against setting up an Asherah besides the altar of the Lord, not in the Holy of Holies, besides the altar. So it's possible Manasseh violated that command without actually entering the innermost sanctuary. Now, this theory often connects to the Ethiopian view, which is where Graham Hancock comes in. The argument goes like this. The ark was removed during Manasseh's reign and taken to a Jewish colony at Elephantine, and that's an island in the Nile River. There was indeed a Jewish settlement there. We have archaeological evidence for that, including papyri, and there also was a temple there. And from Elephantine, Hancock argues that the ark was actually transported up the Nile into Ethiopia, where it remains to this day in the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in Axum. Now, why Ethiopia? Well, because of Solomon. The Ethiopian tradition recorded in a medieval text called the Kebra Nagast, or the Glory of Kings, and it claims that the Queen of Sheba was Ethiopian, and that she had a son by Solomon named Menelik I, and that Menelik eventually brought the ark to Ethiopia. And so all the Ethiopian monarchs claimed descent from this line, right up through the guy, I don't remember his name, but he died in 1975. But this is a deeply held belief in Ethiopian culture. The Falasha Jews of Ethiopia still practice Mosaic law and certain sacrifices. And the Ethiopian Orthodox Church considers the Book of Enoch canonical. So there's a real and ancient Jewish presence in Ethiopia. But here's the problem. Multiple problems, actually. First, Sheba isn't Ethiopia. Sheba is the land of Saba in the southwest Arabian Peninsula, which is, I think, modern-day Yemen. That's just a geographical fact. The second thing is the Kebra Nagast, or the Ethiopian text that records all this, was composed no earlier than the 6th or 7th century AD. So that's over 1,000 years after the events that it claims to describe. The text really has no relevance contemporary to the biblical period. The third thing is there's no actual evidence the ark was ever at Elephantine. The Elephantine papyri mention that Yahweh dwelt there, but they don't mention the ark. And that phrase, Yahweh dwelling somewhere, is used in the Old Testament text written after the temple was destroyed. And there definitely wasn't an ark. So the phrase doesn't require the ark's presence. Fourthly, the temple built at this place wasn't built according to Solomon's temple design. Hancock sort of implies that it was, but excavations have shown significant differences. The fifth one, and this is really interesting, there's a medieval description by a writer named Abu Salih of the ark being brought out of the church in Axum for a festival. But if you read the full description, and this is where other scholars, there's one named Monroe Stewart, did a careful analysis of this, Abu Salil describes an object that doesn't match the biblical ark at all. He says that it has crosses of gold on it, crosses, and on the Ark of the Covenant. And it's described as being as high as the knee of a man, much smaller than the biblical dimensions. And why would it have crosses if Jesus wasn't even around yet? This actually sounds like a tabat, which was a replica of the tablets of the law that are used in Ethiopian Christian worship. So the Ethiopian theory depends on silence, questionable medieval sources, geographical mistakes, and a description that doesn't really match the ark. And I think that there's a lot of wishful thinking there. Theory 6 is that Manasseh removed it himself. So this is actually the flip side of theory 4. So instead of faithful priests removing the ark to protect it from Manasseh, maybe Manasseh just removed it himself when he installed the Asherah. He didn't really want any competition. But this doesn't really make sense theologically, because apostate Israelites would have understood that Yahweh and Asherah is a divine couple. We have inscriptions from ancient sources that reference Yahweh and his Asherah. And so if you're an apostate, you don't remove Yahweh when you bring in Asherah, you add Asherah to Yahweh, because apparently to these people that they were a pair. And again, there's also no textual evidence that Manasseh even did this. The 7th theory is that Jeremiah hid it. Now we are getting to the really popular one. This theory is ancient and it goes back to the Second Temple period, and multiple texts reference it. The Jewish historian Eupolemus, whose words are preserved in Eusebius, says that when Nebuchadnezzar invaded, the gold that was in the temple and the silver and the brass they chose out and sent to Babylon, except the ark and the tables that were in it. This Jeremiah restained. Interestingly enough, in the book of 2nd Maccabees, which is an apocryphal literature, it says that Jeremiah, being warned of God, commanded the tabernacle and the ark to go with him as he went forth into the mountains where Moses climbed up and saw the heritage of God. That's Mount Nebo. And when Jeremiah came there, he found a hollow cave wherein he laid the tabernacle and the ark and the altar of incense, and so stopped up the door. And then Jeremiah says that this place will remain unknown until the time that God gathers his people again and receive them unto mercy. Then shall the Lord show them these things, as the glory of the Lord shall appear. So this is the source for all those treasure hunters looking for the ark on Mount Nebo. Tom Croster claimed to have found it and took a picture, which the archaeologist Siegfried Horn examined and later was declared a modern fake with a visible nail. This guy named Ron Wyatt claimed to have found it under Gordon's cavalry, in what's called Jeremiah's Grotto, and claimed that Christ's blood seeped through the ground and landed on it. I'm not going to spend too much time on Ron Wyatt because apparently his reputation for accuracy isn't that great. And the thing is, these Second Temple texts are 500 years removed from the events that they describe. 500 years. That's like us writing about Christopher Columbus. And they're not even consistent with each other, because another text from that same period talks about an angel swallowing the ark and not necessarily Jeremiah hiding it. But here's the part that really gets me, and kind of the part that I think that everyone misses. We have contemporary texts from Jeremiah's own time that speak to the issue, and for some reason no one talks about them. Because remember when I said that there's a verse that no one talks about? Well, here it is. Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 16 and 17. And when you have multiplied and been fruitful in the land, in those days, declares the Lord, they shall no more say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. It shall not be made again. At that time, Jerusalem shall be called the throne of the Lord, and all nations shall gather to it in the presence of the Lord in Jerusalem. Let's read this one part again. It shall not come to mind or be remembered. It shall not be made again. So this is Jeremiah. The same Jeremiah that the Second Temple texts claim hid the ark. The actual prophet, writing in his own time, says that the ark won't be remembered, it won't be missed, and it won't be remade. And Jerusalem itself will be called the throne of the Lord. So what does that really tell you? If Jeremiah hid the ark for some future restoration, why would he be writing this? Why would he say that no one would miss it? And why would he say that it won't be remade? And why would he say Jerusalem itself, not the ark, not the mercy seat, Jerusalem will be God's throne? The verse kind of implies that the ark is gone, or that if it's not gone yet, that Jeremiah knows that it's going to be gone. And he's telling the people that it really doesn't matter because God's plan for this is bigger than the object. The presence of the Lord doesn't depend on this gold-covered box. And then there's another verse. Lamentations chapter 2, verse 1, and it's generally accepted that Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. That's why it comes right after Jeremiah in your Bible. It says this: how the Lord in his anger has set the daughter of Zion under a cloud. He has cast down from heaven to the earth the splendor of Israel. He has not remembered his footstool in the day of his anger. His footstool. The ark is called God's footstool in multiple different passages. In Jeremiah, or whoever wrote Lamentation, says that God has not remembered his footstool. And that kind of sounds like the ark is gone and that God let it happen. He didn't seem to protect it, and it seems like he allowed it to be destroyed. And those are the only contemporary texts that we actually have that connect Jeremiah to the fate of the ark, not Second Temple legends from 500 years later. And they suggest that the ark was destroyed and that God intended for it to be irrelevant to his future plans of Israel. Which brings us to what I think is the most likely scenario. The ark was destroyed when Nebuchadnezzar sacked Jerusalem in 586 BC. In 2 Kings chapter 24, in verse 13, it says that Nebuchadnezzar carried off all the treasures of the house of the Lord and the treasures of the kings, and cut in pieces all the vessels of gold in the temple of the Lord, which Solomon, king of Israel, had made. So Nebuchadnezzar cut everything in pieces and then he melted them down. Now, albeit, the ark isn't specifically mentioned, but neither is it mentioned among the items that returned when the exiles came back. Ezra chapter 1 lists what the Persian king allowed for the Jews to actually take back to Jerusalem, and the Ark of the Covenant wasn't on the list. Josephus actually writes about the Second Temple. Tacitus also writes about it. First Maccabees lists the objects. The ark is never mentioned. The Holy of Holies in the Second Temple. In the pseudepigraphic text, Second Esdras puts it plainly. The ark of our covenant has been plundered. So here's what I think we're looking at. Everybody wants to find the ark. There are treasure hunters, documentaries, theories, books, movies. The idea that the sacred object is out there somewhere waiting to be discovered, maybe waiting for the end times. It captures people's imagination, and I get it. It's a really compelling story. But to me, and this is my opinion here, I think the Bible is telling us something a little different. Because think about what the ark represented. It was the throne of God on earth, the meeting place between heaven and humanity, the literally physical divine presence of God. And then God let it be destroyed. But why? Because the whole point of the biblical narrative is that God's presence was never meant to be confined to an object. The ark was a shadow of something greater. It was a placeholder. And the book of Hebrews makes this pretty explicit. The earthly tabernacle and everything in it were copies of the heavenly things. Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 16 says that Jerusalem itself will be called the throne of the Lord. You don't really need an ark for that. The city, the people become the dwelling place of God. And then in the New Testament, it goes even further. You have Acts chapter 2 with Pentecost. The Holy Spirit descends and then the glory of the Lord returns, but it doesn't settle on a golden box in a dark room. It settles on people, individual humans. Paul writes in 1 Corinthians that believers are the temple of the Holy Spirit. The presence of God now dwells in persons and not objects. And the book of Revelation at the very end describes the New Jerusalem. And you know what's interesting about this? Revelation 21 says, I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. There's no temple, there's no ark, there's no Holy of Holies, because God himself is the temple. The symbol has now just been replaced by the reality of that. And I think the ark's destruction or disappearance, however you want to frame it, was always part of the plan. In other words, it kind of served its purpose. It was pointing forward to something greater. And when that greater thing came, the pointer was no longer needed. And I think Jeremiah knew this because he said, it shall not be missed and shall not be made again. And I think that's what makes this whole sort of rabbit hole, really fascinating to me. It's not about this mystery of a hidden treasure. It's like most things that I'm coming to find out are theological statement. The most important religious artifact in ancient Israel vanished without explanation because the text is telling us that it doesn't really matter anymore. The God of Israel isn't confined to a box. He never was. The ark was just a shadow, and you don't need the shadow when the light comes. So that's the Ark of the Covenant. You have a dozen theories, centuries of speculation, and at the end of the day, there's really two verses that I think kind of tie this all in together. It shall not come to mind or be remembered or missed. Maybe Jeremiah was right. For watching, if you enjoyed this video, please consider hitting the subscribe button. It really helps out, my channel and whatnot. If you have any theories that I didn't cover, just let me know in the comments. I'm always kind of interested in this kind of stuff, but I don't know. I hope you enjoyed this one. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.